Dr. Keita Curry is a psychologist. She's also CEO and president of the D.D. Hirsch Mental Health Services. Under her leadership, the agency has more than doubled its services over the past 15 years. Dr. Curry is an outspoken advocate for taking a stand against the stigma of mental illness and sharing her personal story with the hopes of ending discrimination once and for all.
All those people that think that if you have mental illness, you're shooting people or you're living homeless, don't realize that we're living among them. All those people that say they really wouldn't want to work with someone with a mental illness or they really wouldn't want them to live next door, they need to figure out that we're already there, that we're living right next door to them right now, and they don't know it.
Dr. Keita Curry joins me now to share her insights on what more can be done to destigmatize mental illness. And thanks so much for coming in. You've been very candid about your own personal story, which, first of all, I want you to maybe share some of that with our audience. But secondly, why is that so important?
Okay. Well, let me start with the second question, which is why is it so important? Because the research shows that the way to change hearts and minds isn't to educate them about the science of mental illness. Everybody knows that now pretty much. But to take away the fears and the prejudices, you only do that by getting to know people, by living and working next to people. And that's why I think now gay marriage has become accepted, is because all of a sudden people all over the United States and, you know, worldwide started coming out. And oh, my niece, oh, my boss, then it takes away the fear and the stereotypes that you have. So for me, where my journey started was that as a kid I had a very dysfunctional family. My father was a violent alcoholic. We moved constantly. And when I was a teenager, I became I didn't know the word depressed then, but I felt like there was nothing I could do. I felt stuck. I felt helpless because it seemed like whatever I did was not good enough for my mother. I decided I would get on my bicycle and I would run away. I put my cat in the basket and I started riding, and then I realized I don't have anywhere to go because we'd been uprooted so many times that I was living somewhere I didn't know anyone. Probably wouldn't have had anywhere to go anyway because we kept everything a secret. But so I came home and things didn't really get any better. And so I made a suicide attempt, and my mom heard me throwing up and came in. And luckily I lived, obviously, but all she said was, "You're just trying to get attention." And, you know, looking back on it, I felt ashamed that I was trying to get attention then. But then as I got older, I realized, well, yes, I was getting attention. I needed attention. And I don't know that I didn't know that I had a mental illness then, even though it runs in my family, and I'd had an uncle take his life when I was 12. But I just knew that I needed help and that things weren't right.
So what was the path to getting help? Because obviously, you know, one of the words that just jumped right out was you said, I feel ashamed, and shame and guilt. And I mean, these are certain words that go along with stigma. And of course, you were a teenager at that time. And clearly, as a support system, your mom's comments were not all that great. So what was the path to actually seeking out help, and how did it transform your life?
When I was in my 20s, my early 20s, I was married, and I was having another spell where I felt like everything was my fault. I felt like a failure. This is a common thought pattern when people are depressed, and you might have said on paper, what is she talking about? She's not a failure. But inside, that's the way my mind saw the world and saw myself. And so I decided to get therapy. And I think the reason I then knew about therapy is because I took a psychology class in college and fell in love with psychology. Decided I would be one when I grew up, but I hadn't grown up yet. And so, you know, D.D. Hirsch, where I work, where I'm the CEO, serves people like the person I was back then, who didn't have insurance, didn't have much money. And I just feel incredibly lucky that I should come to a point in my life full circle where I'm helping people that needed the same kind of help I needed. Now, did that change my life miraculously? No. I mean, depression, like most illnesses, comes and goes. And so my illness has waxed and waned over the years. And I've had a number of therapists. I've gone to therapy many times, which can be very effective with depression. But ultimately, the thing that made a huge difference is when I started taking an antidepressant, when I started taking medication. And I didn't do that until I was old, until I was already the CEO of D.D. Hirsch, which seems very strange since I'm a psychologist, that I would wait that long.
I have a friend in Michigan, Tom Mahaney, who's involved in Honor for All, and he'd like to see returned veterans from Vietnam who committed suicide, their names up on the wall. And he says that they were victims of war no differently.
Absolutely.
They came back with the same wounds. You know, you may be able to show a physical wound, theirs was psychological. Right. And his big message that he says is, it's not a weakness, it's a wound, which I think is a nice, succinct way of putting it. But how do we turn the narrative around where people stop seeing it as a weakness and start seeing it as a wound?
Well, I think that people have to speak out, and that's why I do, because otherwise our stereotype tends to be that people with mental illness are violent, or they're on the street homeless, or they're walking down the street talking to themselves. And, you know, there are dozens of mental illnesses, you know, anxiety, phobias, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, attention deficit disorder. A lot of people don't even realize that. They think that schizophrenia is just about the only mental illness. But if we don't speak out, no one sees all the successes, all the people that are walking around. And, you know, for example, when I've gone to meetings that are professional meetings about stigma, will it be, okay, well, what are you? Are you a family member? Are you a professional? Or are you what's called a consumer, a word I hate? And it's like, well, I'm all three. I mean, and so this idea that we either are mentally ill or we belong to a different club is just absurd.
It's interesting, you know, your clip that we ran, you know, that you're here you're among us. We're among everyone. You know, and it's funny how categorized mental illness is. And yet, very successful people, Robin Williams comes to mind, Ernest Hemingway, one of the greatest authors, they committed suicide. Obviously, it would have been far better if they'd gotten treatment, as you did. But that stigma, it's there. Do you think that the news media misses opportunities when somebody as famous as Robin Williams dies, not to take time to destigmatize?
You know, I think with Robin Williams, the news media did a pretty good job, because his family and his friends were speaking out and saying he had an illness, he dealt with it for a long time, he you know, he got to a low point, we didn't know how low it was, you know, but we're here to tell people to get help and ask for help. And so I think it was actually a good moment, and also a lot of news media broadcast the National Suicide Prevention hotline number so that people had resources, because there's nothing worse than hearing that somebody took their life and feeling like, well, if they did it, what can I do? I have nowhere to go. And so we need for them to know there is somewhere to go. But in general, the media tends to dwell on the, you know, we talk all about mass murderers, which happen very, very rarely. We don't talk about, you know, the head of CNN who has written, you know, ex-head of CNN who wrote about his debilitating depression, and yet he was incredibly successful. Terry Bradshaw has spoken about his depression. We don't talk about those people. We don't put them on the news.
Well, let's talk about that, because I could come in here with a broken arm and everybody would want to sign it. But if I came in and said, yeah, I went and saw a therapist, you know, I'm really having issues, suddenly you see people recoil in some respects. So do we lack the specific language to have a nice public discourse about this? I mean, what's missing?
Well, I think part of the problem is that the term mental illness is an umbrella for many, many illnesses. So you don't see any walks for mental illness. You know, you don't see any walks for cardiovascular disease, because there's so many illnesses. You know, you might see walks for strokes. And so it's such a diverse group. There's no sense of cohesion even among us as a community, but also then in society. So I think that is one of the problems. And actually the one area where there has been sort of a lot of activism, a lot of openness, is about suicide, because if you belong to that club because you've lost someone or because you've been suicidal or both, it's a defining issue that brings everyone together.
You've been honored for your work with early childhood education. Is the next generation on a better trajectory? I mean, do we have to start that early?
They are. You know, there was just recently a Kaiser study, and they asked people if they would be willing to have someone with serious mental illness live next door. And for the population, you know, of adults in general, 48% of people said they were somewhat or very likely to have let someone live next door, which is pretty appalling, I think. But among people under 30, it was a much higher percentage. It was, you know, it was 60%. So I think there is hope. I think that the youth, they talk about their attention deficit disorder, or they talk about going to therapists. You know, there's still stigma, and you get in that age where you want to be like everyone and not different, and there are a lot of, you know, slurs that, you know, you're mental, you're psycho. But I do think things are changing, but we have a ways to go.
I had a short stint of depression after 9/11, and the other piece of this is the growth that can come out of this. I think, you know, in many ways, I've grown a lot as a result of that, and I think you would probably say the same way. The same things happen with you. I mean, you probably wouldn't be in the position you're in now, have gone down this path without that piece of it. And I think that's the other piece that's kind of missing in the conversation,
You're
too.
right. You're absolutely right, because one, I found I helped myself by being open and honest. I gave up a weight, a burden of feeling like I was keeping a secret, and that if people knew it, I wouldn't be accepted anymore. And so I was freed. I also found that people came to me, and I had the joy of helping them. And the other thing is, I realized that there are aspects of my disorder, which I talk about the depression because that's easy to understand, but I also have something called hypomania, which means I don't go on wild shopping sprees or sleep with everybody, but I do have periods where I can work really hard, and I'm a writer, so I find that it doesn't get me in trouble. And I'm grateful for that. I mean, I'm a poet, and poets have a much higher incidence of mood disorders, you know, depression and mania, so I have received some things. You know, I'm a stronger person. I have certain talents, and it's we need to stop thinking it's all bad.
Yeah, stronger person, and you've shown your strength here today. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Well,